it's a pleasure and an honor really to be part of this conference and to share how an art center like us, the Godan Art Center, has found itself drawn into this question of urban human settlements in the urban space, in the urban realm. I mean, at core, we are actually, of course, supporters and promoters of Kenyan artists. But over time, I think we have found that our artistic mission is just inevitably interlocked with realities of the cities as we try to identify audiences and markets for our artists and so on and so forth. As we try to find space in the city for artists to work, we have just found that there is a connection that has forced us, actually has led us to create a unit of the art center that we call Godan Urban, and Mboya runs the Godan Urban. Now, as our recognition of connecting with the city sort of became even more real for us, I think we began to engage with scholars of Southern urbanism. Their work resonates very closely with what we are doing, what we are intuitively sensing on the ground. And through conversations with them, I think we found convergence between theory and practice, because of course we generate knowledge through practice. And so in these sharing of ideas, we're beginning to see together how our artistic work is also civic work and how it contributes to imagining new urban futures. And one particular scholar whose work we have referenced quite a bit is somebody called Abdulmalik Simone. You may be aware of him if you follow Southern urbanism, and he has said this, I think, which really articulates what we also think about. He says that there is a tendency to approach any analysis of African cities with a wariness, as if such cities are always in need of something that is not already present. However, in viewing cities in this way, what is often missed is a sense of their regularity and ordinariness. The fact is that they do as much as they can with what they have, and have acquired extensive experience along the way, eking out a sense of stability in any way they can. And then, of course, he notes that these urban difficulties are real, they don't stand alone, and that, of course, we generate efforts to protect and compensate and adapt. And this is how you begin to see inventiveness in African cities. And so for nearly 25 years, at the Godan, we've been asking ourselves our own set of questions. So we've been asking, what drives the vision and concepts behind creative expression in our diverse local artists? How is artistic canon evolving within our context? And what societal or philosophical foundations shape our artists? Because we were trying to see how this helps us understand Nairobi itself. What do they choose? Why do they choose what they're working with? What do they remember? What do they fear? What do they hope for in their creative expression? And then, of course, as we began to extend these questions into the realm of the publics, how do people engage with this creative work? How do people navigate the city? How do the people experience place? It became clear that we actually needed to spend a bit more time very intentionally learning about the city. And then that way, hopefully, we could also begin to find our own path as an art center and our own relevance as an art center. So another layer of questioning then, of course, emerged for us, and this was a questioning around sustainability as a not-for-profit organization, reliant on only of fundraising. Kariuki has spoken about that. We challenged ourselves and our partners to really reflect honestly on the meaningfulness of investing in work if a long-term vision is not fully believed in. And so this reflection has also led us to secure ownership of the site that we're in. So we're now a proprietor of land in the city. We're a developer in the city. And so that means that we actually now begin to engage even more robustly with being in the city. And so this role of an art center, reshaping its place through these questions, is something that one of our colleagues has studied. Her name is Kim Gurney. She's an artist, she's a researcher and a writer. She comes out of South Africa. And in a book that she wrote where she was looking at the role of these African art spaces, independent spaces, she calls them, in the cities, their role in the cities, she recognized some things that resonate with us and which I will speak about. And one of them is a principle called convergence. And that brings me to this particular image. So this is an image of the Sankofa bird, for those who are aware of Ghanaian myth. This bird, as you can see, its feet point forwards, but its head looks back. And the story is that it looks back to pull or bring forward insights or precious knowledge from the past. I think we were talking about recognizing local knowledge and so on and so forth. So this bird represents that in Twi Akan mythology. Now, Gurney talks about convergence in African art spaces as spaces or cultural infrastructure that also begins to look back and to think about how history and heritage converge with the present in terms of their space and their role within the city. And for the Go Down, I think we've also made this journey of looking back to try and see what is it that drives us? What is it that can be a common and consistent thread for us around our history and our heritage that also helps us not just navigate the present, but really think about an urban future, urban futures. But of course, convergence is a principle that's not just about looking back and drawing insights from the back. I mean, it's also about convergence in terms of the domains that come together when we're looking at the urban space. Arts, urbanism, youth, community resilience, environment, mobility. It's also about the multiple actors that you find in the urban space. We work with Nairobi County UN Habitat, informal settlements, with women and girls, with policymakers. And then it's also around how visions, long-term and short-term, also converge in this time within the city. Okay. All right, so let me take you to the slides then, which Tom puts pressure on and says, watch the slides. So these sets of collages are really trying to help us understand where do we come from, where have we come from as a city, what informs where we are today, and then, of course, how does that help us think about moving forward. So looking at this collage, you see these two women. This is actually a famous photograph. It's a photograph of old Nairobi circa 1910. These two women are standing in a street that then was known as Bazaar Street. In the actual photograph, because of course we've extracted them from the photograph, they are very comfortable in that space. They actually dominate the image. And as you look through the image to the rest of the street, you can see that they're flanked by a very busy scene of traders, African porters and workers, administrators, all sort of moving and bustling in this old Nairobi, and they are in the middle of that having a conversation. And so the question is, what kind of conversation do we think they might have been having with all of this change that was happening around about that time, where you had missionaries, you had hunters, you had railway workers, you had traders, all of these different kinds of people coming in dhows, coming in planes, coming through the railway into their territory and beginning to give them ideas and a sense of other worlds beyond their villages and their territory. A Kenyan historian called Godwin Murunga says that the early African city was actually one where people of different races, classes, and ethnicities lived and traded and depended on each other. He says early Nairobi was actually cosmopolitan. And he says that later, when a formal planning vision was imposed, and formal planning began around about 1926, and then it actually solidified around about 1948, when the first proper master plan was created. He says it's only later, when that formal planning vision was imposed, that there seemed to be a disconnection from this lived reality, this cosmopolitan lived reality of the city of Nairobi. So in other words, that planning vision failed to see what Simone calls shadow practices, those everyday tactics, behaviors, relationships that enable people to get through the city. But each of these protagonists of the early city, and that's why we call this slide dreaming, had a dream. economic prosperity for those who were building the railway, spiritual expansion for those who brought Christianity, the extension of political empire for those, of course, who were engaged in a colonial expansion. And for local communities, there was also the question of modern adoptions and adaptations as they became engaged in new occupations as carriers, as for soldiers, as cooks, as syces, and as general laborers. Now that character that sits right in the middle riding the zebra actually became a very famous resident of early Nairobi. His name is Dr. Rosendo Ribeiro. He came from Goa. He, of course, found that horses, because of equine fever that was happening within this tropical climate, were actually not very resilient to the territory. And so he said, well, why don't we ride zebras? So creativity and adaptivity, you could say. And there were two minds around zebras. One was the animals were untrainable, and others thought that actually the zebras have already done us enough. They adorn the zoos, they make street crossings and so on, leave them alone. But Ribeiro trained one and actually rode it around town on, for house calls. And I think the point of the story of Ribeiro is that the city, then you begin to see a genealogy of improvisation. That Nairobi started by improvising, and Nairobi continues to improvise. And when we think about urban futures, then we need to see whether that quality or that aspect of improvisation is something that we're trying to, is it something that we're trying to remove out of the question of making a new city? Or is it an aspect of urban futures? Is it a characteristic that actually is a quality that we can carry forward into the future? So the Sankova bird extracts this question of improvisation, this question of learning how to navigate, to chart shadow practices back into the present, forward. Now here comes the next slide, which is winning. So now in 2015, when we began to earnestly plan for the transformation of our own neighborhood at the Go Down, the building and the street itself, and we were working with architects and planners and artists and residents themselves, we realized that we were actually about to bring into reality probably the first large-scale capital investment in cultural infrastructure in Kenya since independence in 1963. So that was 52 years ago. And so we began to then think about how do we internalize this realization that we actually sit within an ongoing endeavor of nation-making and city-making following independence. And so in this collage, you see again the front image, which has Kenyatta and those two politicians who are leaping, is again a very famous and well-known image. It is jubilation at the time of independence. I think that is probably Mboya and Kibaki leaping in joy in the background over there. Behind, we see scenes of citizens expectant and hopeful about what this means. We begin to see them adopting the trappings of modern life. We see a city that at independence seems very ordered and very clean. We see those individuals sort of outlined in yellow, African leadership beginning to take charge of the city. So the very first African mayor, Rubia, to the right, Charles Rubia, and then the very first female mayor of the African city, Margaret Kenyatta, over there to the left. And then that group that is tucked in the corner there are leaders who went to the conferences for independence, the Lancaster House conferences that took place between 1960 and 1963. And what's interesting for me about how they are dressed is that they have put on traditional leader cloaks, skin cloaks, on top of Western suits. Again, this push around your own culture, but also the adoption of what seems to be modern then. I think this is interesting to us because it's this question of how the cultural front then becomes also a vital aspect of defining yourself, identifying yourself, a front of resistance, and therefore an element of pushing for freedom. And you find that later, in 2010, after Kenya now is reviewing the constitution created in 1963, that culture continues to be the foundation of the nation. In fact, that's what the constitution says. And so we began to think about how, thinking about the Sankova bird going back, what do we pull into the present and into the future as we think about urban futures that connects to this question of culture, who we are, and how do we identify? How do we pull that forward into now and into the future as well? I think I will skip that and take us to the next slide. Now here's a slide, again, of images that are taken by a young photographer called Brian Otieno. Brian Otieno, when he took these pictures, was living in Kibra, Nairobi's largest informal settlement. Now what Brian photographs, of course, you can see are things that maps and master plans do not see and do not capture. That rhythm of the everyday life of community, those relationships, those connections, the feeling, the texture of place and space. This girl, right in the center of the image, actually became quite famous. I think she was featured in an article about Brian in the New York Times. In the actual image, again, we've extracted her from the image. She's on a narrow street in Kibra, and on the edges of the street are other young girls looking at her with admiration. She's the focal point for the photographer. And then on the side are mothers and women selling fruits and vegetables and so on and so forth. These other images of people are all Brian's images. They come from Kibra. The children walking out, heading to school, the very sort of cool-looking couple who are decked in a fine sort of gold and purple, and then the young man who is the ultimate cool, walking down with not a boombox, but a TV screen for some reason. I think this begins to represent Nairobi today. So these are images that hold inspiration and constraint within the same frame. Yeah, and that is the truth of Nairobi. I think, as Kariuki was saying, 40% of us live on this side, 60% of us live on the other side. And maybe those percentages are even higher than that. But then again, to go back to the scholar, Malik, Abdul Malik Simone, I mean, he warns us, of course, against romanticizing the human spirit and reminds us that this endurance, this capacity to aspire within these very tight spaces, whether they're tenement housing, whether it's the informal settlement, which is the reality of life for most Nairobians, should not be mistaken for justice, and ingenuity should not absolve the city of its responsibilities. But then he also says something that is very interesting, and that he then sort of studies and tries to eke out in his own research, which is that people generate the real capacity of the city. Not the infrastructure alone, not the master plan or the documents, but the people themselves through their relationships, their creativity, their everyday ingenuity. They hold the city together, and that Nairobi's strength lies in this human infrastructure that persists, that adapts, that reorganizes, and that invents new ways of being and belonging. So the Nairobi that we live in is contradictory, it is inventive, it is restless, it's full of hidden capacities, it's full of ambivalence. It's a city that can surprise you every day with its courage and with its fragility as well. But it's a city in which aspiration is not the absence of struggle, though. It's a decision actually to reach beyond it. And now I'll just share a little bit some of the work then that we have done in this regard. So here are two projects that we have run in the city and continue to run in the city. One is Nainihu, which is a festival that happens in all of the neighborhoods of Nairobi, sort of successively from one year to the next. And the other is Manjano, which is an annual visual arts exhibition that is themed Nairobi, and that is really for anybody living and residing in Nairobi to begin to imagine and think about what they see the city as through creative expression. And the other one is actually residents themselves curating and celebrating their neighborhood through a week-long festival. So what led us to this? What led us to these two activities that we do at the Go Down? I think it was asking ourselves a question: who is Nairobi? Who is Nairobi psychologically and emotionally? And how can we begin to understand who Nairobi is? So the Nainihu Festival, a citywide celebration of neighborhood identities and local creativity, I think did something that was very powerful. I think it brought a sense of civic feeling back to the public consciousness within these neighborhoods and these communities that we were very lucky and privileged to be a part of. The sense that people had of the tie to the neighborhood, even despite the condition of the neighborhood, the things that they could identify as being proud about, things that they could celebrate, was actually very inspiring to see. Yeah. You can see that those divisions of the city were divisions that then were created mostly by the residents themselves, some of them following the kind of administrative division, but some of them being divided according to how people experience and understand those neighborhoods. Mm-hmm. So here, I think what we are picking up and seeing is that culture can help us rehearse new futures. It can help us begin to imagine the city differently, even long before the city physically transforms itself. Yeah. And again, I'm just sort of skipping some of these things because I'm seeing the time. I think one of the very exciting things that came out of Nainihu was in Kibra, where we worked with a saying, a quotation that an old man said, that he said that when we are recognized, we become confident. And so we brought this idea of recognition to our relationship with the city. This year and last year, we started to work with the city of Nairobi in terms of examining these cultural assets that exist within the city, so that the city themselves could begin to appreciate that recognizing and celebrating those neighborhoods and those communities within their jurisdiction is something that is powerful for thinking about how the city can evolve and how the city can plan for itself as well. So this is a learning process. It is something that is just beginning to happen. We'll see where that goes. So this almost final slide is, again, some of the work that we've been doing within our neighborhood. So this is the Go Down neighborhood area. For those who know Nairobi, this is Mombasa Road, takes you out to the airport, takes you out to the CBD, that's the railway city, at the top over there, and the Go Down is situated right over here. That's where we are, okay. And so in this particular area, sort of just zooming into deeper kind of urban work, we then saw that we needed to begin to see how we work on our street and on our building, and how do we begin to do this transformation. So we began to work in a process that actually prioritized listening, engaging community over the business of design, and we were very lucky to work with architects and planners whose method is exactly that. Her City, Her Streets, I think, is an excellent example of engaging a stakeholder group in this process. And here we see a primary stakeholder group that the Go Down has been working with and continues to work with, of women. These are women, some of them are traders on the street, some of them live in the informal settlements just next to this neighborhood area. Some of them are students. And then we also engaged the schools, the primary schools that are in this particular neighborhood as well. And so they themselves assessed the condition of the neighborhood, ideated the kind of change that they wanted to do, worked with digital tools like Minecraft and so on to begin to see what this might look like, and then collaborated very closely with the professionals who then translated, of course, this into the designs that we hope can then be built. So, the Sankofa bird now raises its head. So it was looking back, but now it begins to raise its head. Its feet are still facing forward. So it still thinks about, what does tomorrow look like? I think what we're finding in our work is that urban futures are not abstractions. So we cannot imagine a utopian kind of Nairobi, one that we'll draw out on paper. That they are lived continuities. They're shaped by the same courage, the same imagination, the same contradictions and collective energies that built the dream of independence. And before that, that began to seed Nairobi with the coming of the railway. And that continues. That idea of continuum is something that continues. So today, through the work of women and girls, for example, on Dunga Road, as we saw, through the experiments of artists who animate the city with new narratives and new ways of seeing, through neighborhoods who celebrate Nainihu, which reminds Nairobians of their identity in places, their relationships, the stories they hold collectively, and through the emergence of the Go Down as a civic platform, a place where culture, community, and the city meet, we're extending that story. So the future for us is an extension of the past, but hopefully with lessons that we will not repeat, of things that have not worked, but also lessons that we carry forward of principles and qualities that sustain us moving forward. So this image of the Sankofa bird no longer looking back, but lifting its head upward to new horizons, still its feet remain on the ground, facing forward. This is what it means to be urban facing. That we design cities from the ground up, from lived experience and not drawings alone. That we imagine boldly, but stay accountable to reality. Ambition with grounding. That we experiment, we reflect and iterate. Cities shift through learning, not through one-off announcements. And we see people as co-creators, not recipients. We treat the city as a relational ecosystem. Infrastructure matters, relationships matter as well. We work in the radical middle between what is and what could be. We let the past illuminate the future. We build for the people who will live in the future, especially the youth. We prioritize creativity, resilience, and care. And we cultivate the courage to imagine more than we inherited. This, for us, is Urban Futures work. Thank you for listening.